I'm Maria Holt, 31 years old, a lieutenant in the United States Navy. I've faced Atlantic storms that could snap a destroyer in half, but no hurricane was ever as destructive as the man sitting across the table from me, my own father. That afternoon at the lawyer's office, my cheek was burning. It wasn't from the salt spray or the wind. It was from a backhanded slap my father delivered right in front of 40 of our closest relatives. I tasted copper. Blood was trickling from the corner of my lip. My father stood over me, veins bulging in his neck, screaming, "You selfish little brat! Sign the transfer papers for your brother. He's a man. He needs this house more than you do." My brother, Eric, just sat there, smirking, legs crossed, acting like robbing me of my inheritance was his birthright. They thought I was still the weak little black sheep they could bully. But they didn't know that the man sitting at the head of the table, my late grandfather's attorney, was holding a file that wouldn't just strip them of the roof over their heads, but was about to send my father to federal prison for bank fraud. If you've ever been asked to set yourself on fire just to keep your ungrateful family warm, type "Justice" in the comments and listen to this. The conference room at Harper & Dunn was designed to intimidate. It smelled of old money, a mixture of lemon furniture polish, leather-bound law books, and the stale, recycled air of expensive air conditioning. I walked in, my heels clicking rhythmically on the hardwood floor. I was wearing my service dress white uniform, choker collar, ribbons perfectly aligned, every crease sharp enough to cut glass. It was a suit of armor I'd earned through sweat and tears. But the moment I stepped across the threshold, I felt that old, familiar, suffocating feeling. To the United States Navy, I was a lieutenant. To the people in this room, I was invisible. About 40 relatives were crammed into the room, buzzing like flies. Aunts who hadn't sent me a birthday card in a decade. Cousins who only called when they needed bail money. They all went silent as I entered. Their eyes weren't welcoming. They were calculating. They were vultures circling a carcass, waiting to see what scraps my grandfather, Walter Morgan, had left behind. And there, sitting at the head of the mahogany table as if he owned the building, was my father, Robert Holt. He looked like a caricature of a Westport gentleman falling from grace. He was wearing a navy blue blazer that was straining at the buttons and a pair of khakis that had seen better days. Even from 10 feet away, I could smell him. It was a nauseating blend of Old Spice cologne trying desperately to cover up the sour, oaky stench of Jim Beam bourbon. He was already drunk at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday. Next to him sat Eric, my older brother, the golden child. He was 34 years old, wearing a Ralph Lauren polo shirt that I knew he put on my dad's credit card. He didn't even look at me. He was too busy scrolling through his iPhone, looking bored, as if attending his grandfather's will reading was a massive inconvenience to his unemployed schedule. I took the only empty seat, directly across from them. Arthur Callahan, my grandfather's attorney and oldest friend, cleared his throat. He was 70 years old, with eyes like steel traps. "Shall we begin?" Arthur asked, his voice deep and gravelly. "We are here to read the last will and testament of—" "Cut the crap, Arthur," my father interrupted, slamming his hand on the table. The sudden noise made Aunt Linda jump. "We all know the drill. Dad left the house to me. Let's just sign the papers so I can get back to work." Work, I thought. Dad hadn't worked a real day in 5 years. He spent his days driving his leased Ford F-150 around town to keep up appearances. Arthur adjusted his glasses, his expression unreadable. "Robert, please sit down. I don't have time for your billable hours." Dad reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of notebook paper. He slid it across the polished table toward me. It looked like something a child had scrawled on. "Sign this, Maria," Dad commanded. He didn't ask. He ordered. I looked down. It was a handwritten note stating that I, Maria Holt, voluntarily relinquished any and all claims to the estate in favor of Eric Holt. I looked up, meeting his bloodshot eyes. "What is this?" "It's a formality," Dad sneered, his lip curling. "You're in the Navy. You have the government taking care of you. You have a cot to sleep on and a mess hall to eat in. You don't need a house in Connecticut. Eric needs it. He's a man. He has a future to build. The sexism was so casual, so practiced, it almost didn't register as an insult. It was just the air we breathed in the Holt house. Eric finally looked up from his phone and gave a small, pitiful shrug, as if to say, "What can you do? I'm just special." "I'm not signing that," I said. My voice was calm, trained by years of shouting commands over the roar of jet engines. "Grandpa wanted me here. I'm waiting for Mr. Callahan to read the will." "You selfish bitch," Dad hissed. The room went deadly silent. "After everything I've done for you, you think you're better than us because of that costume you're wearing?" "It's a uniform, Dad. And yes, I am not signing." He moved faster than I expected for a drunk man. He lunged across the corner of the table. I saw the motion, but I didn't flinch. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Crack! His open palm connected hard with the side of my face. The sound echoed off the wood paneling like a gunshot. The force of it knocked me sideways, my chair skidding against the floor. I tasted the hot, metallic tang of blood instantly as my lips split against my teeth. Gasps filled the room. Uncle Bob half rose from his chair but didn't move to help. Eric actually let out a short, sharp laugh. I slowly straightened my chair. I didn't touch my face. I didn't cry. I sat at attention, just like I was taught, staring straight ahead. The stinging sensation on my cheek was unbearable, but the fire in my chest was hotter. "You ungrateful little—" Dad raised his hand again, his face purple with rage. Thump! A massive legal binder hit the heavy table with the force of a gavel. The sound was so loud it stopped my father mid-swing. Arthur Callahan was standing now. He wasn't just an old lawyer anymore, he was a towering figure of judgment. He glared at my father with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. "Sit down, Robert," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly low register. "Stay out of this, Arthur. She's my daughter. I'll discipline her how I see fit," Dad shouted, trying to regain his composure, adjusting his blazer. Arthur opened the blue folder in front of him. He looked at the blood on my lip, then looked directly at my father. The silence in the room was heavy, suffocating. "Mr. Holt," Arthur said, articulating every syllable with lethal precision. "I strongly suggest you keep your hands to yourself, because you just struck the actual owner of the house you're living in." The stinging sensation on my cheek began to fade into a dull, throbbing ache, but the memory it unlocked was sharper than ever. That slap wasn't an isolated incident, it was the physical punctuation mark on a sentence that had been written since I was 5 years old. Sitting there in that air-conditioned law office, staring at the man who had just struck me, I wasn't seeing the aging alcoholic in a cheap blazer. I was seeing the father who had systematically erased me from his life, one missed milestone at a time. You see, in the Holt household, there were two distinct roles. Eric was the golden child, the fragile prince who needed to be protected from the cruel world. And I was the insurance policy, the backup plan, the one who was low maintenance. It started with the birthdays. I remember my sweet 16 vividly. In Westport, turning 16 is a coronation. Girls in my grade were getting leased Jettas or lavish parties at the country club. I didn't expect a car. I knew we were house poor, living in a mansion we could barely heat. But I expected something. I came home from swim practice that day, hair wet and smelling of chlorine, to find the house dark. Mom was in the kitchen, looking exhausted. There was a store-bought sheet cake from Stop and Shop on the counter, still in the plastic container with the clearance sticker on it. Dad and Eric were in the living room watching the Patriots game. Dad didn't even look up when I walked in. He just yelled, "Maria, keep it down, it's third and long." No happy birthday, no balloons. Just a clearance cake and the flickering light of the TV. Contrast that with Eric. When Eric turned 16, despite having a GPA that started with a decimal point, Dad threw him a catered BBQ in the backyard. He invited half the neighborhood to show off. Eric got a brand new MacBook and a promise of a car if he brought his grades up. He never did. But the real knife in the heart wasn't the material stuff. It was the presence. Throughout high school, I practically lived in the pool. I was the varsity swim captain by my junior year. I woke up at 4:30 a.m. every single morning to train. I smelled permanently of chlorine and determination. I broke the state record for the 100-meter butterfly during the regional championships. I remember standing on the podium, the gold medal heavy around my neck, water dripping from my nose. I looked up into the bleachers, searching the sea of parents cheering for their kids. I saw Sarah Miller's dad waving a giant foam finger. I saw the entire Johnson family screaming. I looked for Robert Holt. I looked for that blue blazer. The seat was empty. Again. He had promised he'd be there. But later, I found out why he wasn't. He was at the principal's office. Eric had been caught smoking pot under the bleachers of the football field during gym class. It was his third strike. He was facing expulsion from the public high school. That night, the house was a war zone, but not at Eric. Dad was screaming at the school district on the phone, threatening to sue them for targeting his son. "He's a sensitive boy," Dad bellowed, pouring himself another glass of bourbon. "This public school environment is too toxic for him. He needs guidance, not punishment." The solution? Dad drained his 401k and took out a second loan to send Eric to Cheshire Academy, a private boarding school that costs $30,000 a year. I was sitting at the kitchen table, doing my AP calculus homework, trying to make myself as small as possible. I looked at my mother. She was washing dishes, her back to me, shoulders slumped. "Mom," I whispered, "I got the gold medal today." She turned around, wiping her hands on a rag. Her eyes were sad, tired, and defeated. She came over and kissed my forehead, but her words were the ones that truly scarred me. "I know, honey. We're proud of you," she sighed, glancing nervously at Dad in the other room. "But please, don't make a fuss right now. Your father is stressed. You're strong, Maria. You've always been the strong one. You can take care of yourself. Eric is weaker. He needs us more. You're strong. He's weak." That was the sentence. That was the justification for every neglect, every overlooked achievement, every dollar siphoned away from my future to pay for Eric's mistakes. Because I was competent, I was punished. Because Eric was a mess, he was rewarded. I know I'm not the only one who has felt this. If you were the strong child who had to grow up too fast while the troublemaker got all the love and attention, please hit that like button right now. And tell me in the comments, what was the moment you realized you were on your own? I read every single one of them. The breaking point didn't come with a bang, but with a quiet, cold realization. It was the summer after graduation. I had been accepted to UConn with a partial scholarship, but I needed a co-signer for a small student loan to cover the rest. I brought the papers to Dad. He laughed. He literally laughed in my face. "I can't sign that, Maria. My credit is tied up with Eric's tuition. You're smart. Figure it out. Get a job." 2 days later, I came home to find a brand new jet ski in the driveway. A graduation present for Eric. That was the day the little girl waiting for her daddy on the bleachers finally died. I didn't argue. I didn't scream. I walked into my bedroom, the room with the peeling paint because they couldn't afford to fix it, and I made a decision. I wasn't going to college in the fall. I wasn't going to stay in Westport and watch them drown in their own dysfunction. I went to the Navy recruiting office in Norwalk the next morning. I signed the papers before lunch. 3 months later, the morning I left for boot camp, the house was silent. Dad was hungover, asleep on the recliner. Eric wasn't home. He was probably out partying on the jet ski I helped pay for by simply not existing as an expense. I didn't have nice luggage. I didn't have a trunk. I opened the kitchen drawer and took out a roll of black hefty garbage bags. I packed my entire life into 2 garbage bags. My clothes, my swim trophies, my few books. I cinched the plastic ties tight. As I dragged those black plastic bags down the driveway toward my rusted Honda Civic, I caught my reflection in the car window. I didn't look like a Westport debutante. I looked like trash being taken out to the curb. But as I threw those bags into the trunk and slammed the lid shut, I felt something shift in my chest. It was a cold, hard resolve. "I am never coming back," I whispered to the empty driveway. I thought I was leaving the garbage behind. I didn't realize then that you can drive 1,000 miles away, you can wear a uniform, you can become a warrior. But the ghosts of the people who were supposed to love you will always try to drag you back home. And now, 13 years later, sitting in this lawyer's office, staring at the handwritten note demanding I give up the only thing Grandpa left me, I realized my mother was wrong. I wasn't just strong, I was dangerous. And they were about to find out what happens when the strong one finally fights back. If you have never experienced Naval Station Great Lakes in the dead of winter, you don't know what cold is. It wasn't just a temperature, it was a physical assault. The wind coming off Lake Michigan didn't just chill you, it hunted you. It found every gap in your uniform, every weakness in your resolve, and it tried to freeze you from the inside out. But for me, the cold was a mercy. It numbed the pain of leaving home. My new reality was a world of gray concrete, shouting voices, and absolute, non-negotiable discipline. My recruit division commander, a petty officer first class with a voice like a chainsaw, didn't care that my father ignored me or that my brother was the favorite. He didn't care about my feelings at all. He only cared about one thing. Could I follow orders? It started with the bed. Every morning at 0500, while the rest of the world was still hitting the snooze button, I was standing in front of a twin-sized mattress, learning how to make hospital corners. It sounds ridiculous, right? Folding a sheet at a perfect 45-degree angle. Smoothing out the wool blanket until you could literally bounce a quarter off it. I remember one morning, my hands were cracked and bleeding from the dry air and the constant scrubbing of decks. I was exhausted, running on 4 hours of sleep. I looked at that bed, and I remembered a speech I'd read by Admiral McRaven. He said that if you make your bed every morning, you will have accomplished the first task of the day. It will give you a small sense of pride, and it will encourage you to do another task and another. So, I made the bed. I smoothed the wrinkles. I made it perfect. In that small act, I found something I never had in Westport: control. I couldn't control my father's drinking. I couldn't control Eric's entitlement. But I could control this bed. I could control my uniform. I could control my mind. While I was crawling through mud pits under barbed wire, gasping for air in the tear gas chamber, and eating MREs, meals ready to eat, that tasted like cardboard and preservatives, my old life was continuing without me. I remember one rare afternoon during holiday routine when we were allowed access to our phones for 30 minutes. I opened Instagram, my fingers stiff and calloused. The first photo on my feed was Eric. He was in Cabo San Lucas for spring break. He was shirtless, holding a bottle of tequila, surrounded by girls in bikinis. He looked tan, happy, and completely unburdened. The caption read, "Living the life. Thanks, Pops." I looked down at my own dinner, a packet of Chili Mac MRE that I was heating up with a chemical reaction bag. Eric was burning through thousands of dollars of Dad's money on shots and jet skis. I was earning my paycheck, meager as it was, by learning how to keep a ship afloat during combat. The contrast made my stomach turn, but it also fueled a fire in my gut. Let him have the fun. I was building a future. 5 years went by. They weren't easy years, but they were mine. I worked my way up. I went from an enlisted sailor to an officer, earning my commission through sheer grit. I became a lieutenant junior grade. I deployed. I saw the Atlantic, the Mediterranean. I stood watch on the bridge of a destroyer in the middle of the night, looking at stars that seemed brighter than anything in Connecticut. And I did something else. Something that felt better than any party in Cabo. I paid off my student loans. I remember the day I did it. I was sitting in my small, sparsely furnished apartment in Norfolk, Virginia. I logged into the Navient website. The balance was $1,245. I had exactly $1,500 in my checking account. I clicked Submit Payment. The screen flashed, Paid in full. I sat back in my cheap IKEA chair and just breathed. I drove a 5-year-old Honda Civic that I bought with cash. I lived in a 1-bedroom apartment. I owned almost nothing of value by Westport standards, but I owned myself. My name was on the title of my car. My signature was on my lease. I didn't owe Robert Holt a single dime. The phone rang 2 weeks later. I looked at the caller ID. Dad! My heart hammered against my ribs. It had been 5 years. We had spoken maybe twice at Christmas, brief, awkward exchanges. Why was he calling now? A tiny, foolish part of me, the little girl who waited on the bleachers, thought, maybe he just wants to see how I am. Maybe he's proud. Hello? I answered, my voice steady. Maria, how are you, kiddo? His voice was too loud, too cheerful. I could hear the clink of ice in a glass in the background. I'm fine, Dad. I'm a lieutenant now. That's great, that's great. He rushed past my news as if I had said I bought a new pair of shoes. Listen, honey, I'm in a bit of a bind. It's Eric. My stomach dropped. Of course. What happened? Well, you know how the economy is. He's had some bad luck. He got pulled over last night. Some overzealous cop slapped him with a DUI. It's ridiculous, really. He only had a few beers. But the lawyer says we need $5,000 for the retainer and bail, or he's going to spend the weekend in lockup. He paused. I could hear him breathing. I'm a little tapped out right now. Cash flow issues. Dad continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. I know the Navy pays you guys pretty well. Could you wire me the money? I'll pay you back next month, I swear. Silence stretched between Norfolk and Westport. He wasn't calling to ask if I was alive. He wasn't calling to congratulate me on my promotion. He was calling because his golden child had messed up, and he wanted the spare part to pay for the fix. No, I said. Excuse me? No, Dad, I don't have $5,000 for Eric's bail, and even if I did, I wouldn't give it to you. Are you serious? His fake cheer evaporated instantly, replaced by the venom I knew so well. He's your brother. He's sitting in a cell. You're just going to leave him there? You selfish, cold-hearted. He's 33 years old, Dad. Let him sit. I hung up the phone before he could finish the curse word. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from adrenaline. I felt like I had just cut away a heavy anchor that had been dragging me down for decades. I walked over to my metal locker, a habit from ship life that I kept in my apartment. I opened the door. Taped to the inside, right at eye level, was a small black and white photograph. It wasn't a picture of my parents. It wasn't a picture of Eric. It was a photo of an old man standing next to a 1965 Mustang, smiling with a kind of gentle strength that I missed every single day. My grandfather, Walter Morgan. He was the only one who had ever looked at me and seen a person, not a burden. He was the one who taught me that character is what you do when no one is looking. I touched the photo with my thumb. I held the line, Grandpa, I whispered to the picture. I didn't give in. I didn't know it then, but Grandpa Walter had done a lot more than just leave me with good advice. He had left me a shield. And in a few days, back in that lawyer's office, that shield was about to become a sword. The room was dead silent, save for the heavy breathing of my father, who was still standing with his hand raised, looking at the lawyer with a mixture of shock and drunken defiance. Arthur Callahan stared him down, his eyes cold behind his wire-rimmed glasses. In that suspended moment, staring at Arthur, a man who had been my grandfather's best friend since their days in the VFW hall, the sterile smell of the law office faded away. The coppery taste of blood in my mouth triggered a memory, pulling me out of that room and transporting me back to the only place I had ever felt safe. Suddenly, I wasn't 31. I was 16. I wasn't in a high-rise office. I was in a red vinyl booth at Harry's Diner on the Post Road, a greasy spoon that smelled of bacon grease, old coffee, and comfort. It was our secret ritual. Every Sunday, while Dad was sleeping off a hangover and Mom was nervously cleaning the house for the third time, I would sneak out the back door. Grandpa Walter would be waiting for me in his 1965 Mustang, the engine idling with a low, steady rumble. We wouldn't say much on the drive. Grandpa was a World War II veteran, a man who had seen the Pacific Theater and learned that words were cheap, but actions meant everything. We'd park, walk into the diner, and sit in the same booth near the back. The waitress, a woman named Dottie who had a beehive hairdo that defied gravity, would bring our order without us even asking. Black coffee for him and a slice of warm apple pie a la mode for me. I could see him now, clear as day. He was wearing his flannel shirt and suspenders, his hands weathered and spotted with age, shaking slightly as he held his coffee mug. "How are things at the asylum?" he would ask. That was his name for my parents' house. "Dad bought a new boat," I told him once, pushing my fork into the melting vanilla ice cream. "But he told Mom we can't afford to fix the furnace." Grandpa Walter didn't get angry. He didn't yell. He just took a slow sip of his coffee and shook his head, a look of profound disappointment in his eyes. "Your father," Grandpa said, his voice gravelly, "is a man who buys things he doesn't need, with money he doesn't have, to impress people he doesn't like. He thinks being a man is about what you own. He's forgot that being a man is about what you protect." He reached across the table and slid his own scoop of ice cream onto my plate. He knew I loved the ice cream more than the pie. It was a small gesture, but it screamed louder than any "I love you" my father ever failed to say. "Don't be like him, Maria," he told me, looking me dead in the eye. "You have iron in your spine. I saw you swim last week. You didn't quit when you were tired. That's worth more than any boat. Remember, money is just a tool. If you don't control it, it controls you, and right now, it controls your father." I didn't know it then, but in those quiet moments over apple pie, Grandpa wasn't just feeding me dessert. He was evaluating me. He was testing my character against my father's greed. And he had made a decision. Snap. The sound of Arthur Callahan unclasping the thick legal binder brought me crashing back to the present. The smell of bacon and coffee vanished, replaced by the stench of my father's cheap bourbon. Arthur didn't sit down. He remained standing, dominating the room. He looked at my father, then at Eric, and finally, his eyes softened just a fraction as they landed on me. "Robert," Arthur said, his voice devoid of any warmth, "you seem to be under the impression that this proceeding is a standard probate case. You assume that because you are Walter's only son, you are the heir apparent to his estate." "It's not an assumption, Arthur," Dad spat, adjusting his blazer as he finally sat back down, trying to regain his dignity. "I'm his next of kin. It's the law." "Under normal circumstances, yes," Arthur agreed. He pulled a document from the file. It looked old. The paper was slightly yellowed. However, Walter was a man who planned ahead. He came to me 13 years ago, specifically the week Maria left for boot camp. My heart skipped a beat. 13 years ago? "Walter was very concerned," Arthur continued. "He knew about your gambling debts, Robert. He knew about the second mortgage you took out on your own home. And he knew that if he left his property to you in a standard will, the bank, or the IRS, would seize it within 6 months to pay off your liabilities." "That's a lie!" Dad shouted, but his face went pale. "So?" Arthur ignored him. "Walter did not leave the house to you in his will. In fact, the house hasn't belonged to Walter for over a decade." The room went so quiet you could hear the hum of the air conditioner. Arthur held up the document. On October 15, 2011, Walter Morgan transferred the deed of the property at 42 Oakwood Lane into an irrevocable living trust. I gasped. I knew enough about the law to know what that meant. A living trust bypassed probate. It was ironclad. "And who is the trustee?" Eric asked, his voice cracking. He looked nervous for the first time. "Is it me?" Arthur looked at Eric with pity, then turned his gaze to me. "The trust was established for the sole benefit of the one person Walter believed had the discipline to maintain his legacy," Arthur said. He picked up a smaller, handwritten letter from the file. "He asked me to read this note before I hand over the keys." Arthur adjusted his glasses and began to read. It was Grandpa's voice. I could hear it. "To my granddaughter, Maria. If you are hearing this, I am gone. I know your father has likely tried to bully you today. I know your brother has likely expected a handout. I'm sorry I cannot be there to stop them, but I have done the next best thing. I watched you leave for the Navy with nothing but 2 garbage bags, Maria. You didn't ask me for a dime. You stood on your own 2 feet. You are the only person in this bloodline who understands the value of a dollar and the weight of integrity. I didn't leave the house to your father because he would sell it to pay for his mistakes. I didn't leave it to Eric because he has never earned a thing in his life. The house is yours, Maria. It has been yours since the day you left. Welcome home, kiddo." Arthur lowered the letter. He looked at my father, whose mouth was hanging open, his face a mask of absolute horror. "So, Mr. Holt," Arthur said, closing the binder with a finality that shook the table. "When you just slapped Maria, you didn't assault your daughter, you assaulted the landlord, and I believe she has the right to evict you." I walked out of Harper & Dunn with a set of keys in my hand that felt heavier than a loaded pistol. Arthur offered to call the police to escort me, but I refused. This was my house now. And in the Navy, you don't ask the police to secure your ship, you do it yourself. I left my father and Eric behind, still arguing with Arthur in the conference room, and drove my battered Honda Civic straight to 42 Oakwood Lane. The drive through Westport was like driving through a magazine spread for better homes and gardens. The lawns were manicured to golf course perfection. American flags waved lazily from pristine front porches. Hydrangeas bloomed in perfectly symmetrical rows. It was a town obsessed with image, where a single dandelion was considered a moral failing. And then, I turned onto my street. You didn't need a GPS to find the Holt residence. You just had to look for the eyesore that was dragging down the property values of the entire block. The house, a colonial-style mansion that Grandpa Walter had built with pride, looked like it was suffering from a terminal illness. The white paint, once gleaming, was peeling away in long gray strips like dead skin. The shutters hung crookedly. But it was the lawn that made my stomach turn. The grass wasn't just uncut, it was a meadow. It was shin-high, choked with crabgrass and dandelions. A bright orange sticker was slapped onto the front door, a citation from the Homeowners Association, HOA, for unsightly maintenance violations. I parked in the driveway, noticing the fresh oil stains on the pavement where Dad parked his leased Ford F-150. That truck was shiny and new, costing probably $800 a month, while the house behind it was rotting. It was the perfect metaphor for Robert Holt, a shiny bumper on a wrecked chassis. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The smell hit me instantly. It wasn't the smell of home. It was the smell of stagnation. It was a thick, cloying mixture of stale beer, wet dog, even though we didn't have a dog, and that distinct, dusty odor of a house that hasn't been properly cleaned in years. "Hello," I called out, just out of habit. The house answered with silence. I walked into the living room, and my boots stuck slightly to the hardwood floor. Someone had spilled a soda weeks ago and never wiped it up. This was Eric's domain. It looked less like a living room and more like a fraternity house basement. The blackout curtains were drawn tight, blocking out the afternoon sun. Dominating the room was a massive 85-inch 4K television, brand new, likely worth $3,000. Beneath it sat the latest PlayStation and Xbox consoles, their controllers tangled in a web of wires. Surrounding this altar of technology was a graveyard of consumption. Domino's pizza boxes were stacked like Jenga towers on the coffee table. Empty cans of Monster Energy drink were scattered across the floor, some crushed, some half full and attracting ants. A laundry basket overflowed with Eric's designer clothes, Ralph Lauren, Vineyard Vines, all crumpled and stained. I looked at the chaos with a cold military detachment. This was a 34-year-old man's life. He had no job, no prospects, and no shame. He lived like a king in a castle he didn't pay for, while Dad enabled every pathetic inch of it. I didn't touch anything. I turned on my heel and headed for the one room that mattered, the study. This used to be Grandpa's sanctuary. It was where he taught me how to balance a checkbook. It smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper back then. I pushed the heavy oak door open. Dad had taken over this room, obviously. The air here was heavy with the smell of despair. The beautiful mahogany desk was buried under mountains of paper. Not organized files, but piles of unopened mail. It was the filing system of a man who is terrified of the truth. I walked behind the desk and sat in the leather chair. It squeaked in protest. I felt like an intruder, but then I remembered Arthur's words. "You are the landlord." I started digging. The first layer of the pile was standard junk mail. Credit card offers. Catalogs for luxury watches Dad couldn't afford. The second layer was darker. Past due notices, Verizon, Eversource Electric, the water company. All of them had angry red stamps on them. Dad was months behind on utilities. But as I dug deeper, reaching the bottom of the drawer where he had shoved the things he really didn't want to see, my blood ran cold. I found a thick envelope from First National Bank. It had been opened, crumbled, and smoothed back out. I pulled out the letter. The header was in bold, terrifying font. Notice of default and intent to foreclose. I scanned the document, my military training kicking in, looking for the data points. Borrower, Robert Holt. Property, 42 Oakwood Lane. Loan type, HELOC, Home Equity Line of Credit. Outstanding balance, $845,000. I froze. I reread the number. $845,000. Confusion washed over me, followed quickly by a sharp pang of suspicion. Wait, I whispered to the empty room. This doesn't make sense. Arthur had just told me that the house was in an irrevocable trust. That meant Grandpa owned it through the trust, not Dad. To take out a home equity line of credit, you have to own the equity. You have to be on the deed. How could my father borrow nearly $1 million against a house that legally didn't belong to him? I scrambled through the papers, looking for the loan application. I found a copy of the deed attached to the loan documents. My eyes widened. There, at the bottom of the deed transfer, was a signature. Walter Morgan. The date on the signature was 2 years after Grandpa died. My breath hitched in my throat. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Dad hadn't just been irresponsible. He hadn't just been lazy. He had forged a dead man's signature. He had committed federal bank fraud to turn Grandpa's legacy into a personal ATM for his booze and Eric's toys. Outside, the gravel crunched. I heard the distinctive roar of a Ford F-150 engine aggressively revving in the driveway. A car door slammed shut. Then, another. "Where is she?" I heard Dad's voice screaming from the front yard, slurring and enraged. "Where is that ungrateful little traitor?" I looked down at the paperwork in my hand, the evidence of a felony that would put my father in prison for 20 years. I didn't feel fear anymore. I stood up, smoothing the front of my white uniform. I picked up the stack of papers. The inspection was over. It was time for the court-martial. The front door slammed shut downstairs with enough force to shake the floorboards beneath my feet. "Maria!" My father's voice roared from the foyer, a slurred, guttural sound that echoed up the staircase. "Get down here. I'm not done with you." I checked my watch. Based on the heaviness of his footsteps and the stumbling rhythm, I estimated I had less than 2 minutes before he made it up the stairs. 2 minutes. In the Navy, you can launch a counteroffensive in less time than that. I ignored his shouting. I sat in Grandpa's leather chair, my heart rate steady, my eyes locked on the stack of papers in front of me. The document in my hand wasn't just a bill. It was a crime scene. It was a loan application for a home equity line of credit, HELOC, from First National Bank, dated June 14, 2019. I stared at the date. June 2019. My grandfather, Walter Morgan, died in February 2017. I flipped to the signature page. There, on the line marked Owner-Borrower, was a signature, Walter Morgan. It was a forgery. And it wasn't even a good one. The handwriting was shaky, mimicking Grandpa's old-fashioned cursive, but I recognized the heavy, aggressive pen strokes. It was Dad's hand. He had walked into a bank 2 years after his own father's funeral and pretended Grandpa was still alive to secure a loan. He must have forged a power of attorney or bribed a notary public. In the state of Connecticut, that's not just fraud. That's identity theft and grand larceny. "He didn't just break the rules," I whispered, my finger tracing the fake signature. "He broke the law." I flipped to the transaction history. If Dad had borrowed nearly $850,000 against the house, where did the money go? The house was falling apart. The roof was leaking. The money certainly wasn't spent on maintenance. I followed the money trail. It was sickening. October 2019, wire transfer, $85,000, BMW of Ridgefield. That was Eric's M3, the one he accidentally wrapped around a telephone pole 3 months later. Dad had told everyone insurance covered it. That was a lie. He bought it cash with Grandpa's equity. November 2019 through present, cash withdrawals, Mohegan Sun Casino. The entries were repetitive and escalating. $5,000. $10,000. One weekend in July showed a withdrawal of $50,000. My father wasn't just a casual gambler, he was a whale. He was hemorrhaging money at the blackjack tables, betting away the legacy Grandpa spent 50 years building. Monthly recurring payment, American Express, $12,400. I looked at the reference number. It was linked to a platinum card. The supplementary card holder, Eric Holt. My brother was living a six-figure lifestyle, dinners in New York City, bottle service at clubs, designer clothes, and he was paying for it with the walls of this house. I felt a cold fury rising in my chest, different from the anger I felt earlier. This was clarity. They hadn't just been mean to me, they were criminals. They were parasites who had hollowed out this family from the inside. If I called the FBI right now, Robert Holt wouldn't just be evicted. He would be facing federal charges. Wire fraud alone carries a sentence of up to 20 years. The realization hit me hard. I wasn't just holding a file, I was holding the button to a nuclear option. I could destroy him. I could send my own father to a federal penitentiary where he'd trade his Ralph Lauren blazers for an orange jumpsuit. I know I'm not the only one who has discovered a betrayal like this. It's a terrible feeling when you realize the people who are supposed to protect you are actually the ones stealing from you. If you believe that fraud is unforgivable, especially when it's family, please hit that like button right now. And tell me in the comments, if you found this evidence against your father, would you call the police? Type yes or no. Thump, thump, thump. The footsteps were in the hallway now, heavy, angry. Don't go in there, Dad, she's crazy. That was Eric's voice, high-pitched and whining, close behind him. Shut up, Eric. This is my house. I'll do what I want. The doorknob to the study rattled violently. It was locked. I had turned the latch the moment I walked in. Open this door, Maria, Dad screamed, pounding on the heavy oak wood. Open it or I'll kick it down. I stood up slowly. I didn't rush. I picked up the HELOC application, the bank statements, and the foreclosure notice. I aligned them perfectly in my hand. I took a deep breath. I checked my uniform one last time in the reflection of the window. I wasn't the scared teenager packing garbage bags anymore. I was an officer. And I was about to confront a hostile insurgent. I said, open it. Bam! The door splintered near the lock. He kicked it again. With a loud crack, the frame gave way, and the door swung open, banging against the bookshelf. Robert Holt stood in the doorway, breathing heavily. His face was a mask of red, sweaty rage. His tie was loosened, his hair disheveled. He looked like a man on the edge of a cliff, though he didn't know it yet. Eric peeked out from behind him, looking terrified, his eyes darting around the room to see what I had touched. Who do you think you are? Dad snarled, stepping into the room, his fist clenched at his sides. You think you can just walk in here and lock me out of my own office? You think that piece of paper Arthur read means anything? I am the man of this house. He took a menacing step toward me, raising his finger to point in my face. You are going to sign that deed transfer, Maria. Right now. Or so help me God, I will. You'll what? I interrupted. My voice was dangerously low. You'll hit me again. You'll forge my signature like you forged Grandpa's. Dad froze mid-step. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Eric went pale. What did you say? I lifted the file in my hand, holding it up like a weapon. I turned the page so the fake signature was facing them. I know everything, Dad, I said, my eyes locking onto his. I know about the HELOC. I know about the $800,000. I know about the casino runs to Mohegan Sun. And I know you committed federal bank fraud to get it. The color drained from my father's face so fast it looked like he was having a stroke. His arrogance evaporated, replaced instantly by the terrified look of a criminal who realizes the cops have arrived. He stammered, his hands shaking. That's not. Arthur calls this a dispute over a will, I said, stepping forward, forcing him to take a step back. But the FBI, they call this a felony. I tossed the file onto the desk. It landed with a heavy thud between us. So, I said, crossing my arms, let's talk about who is really leaving this house today. The air in the room was electric, charged with 30 years of unsaid words and suppressed anger. My father stared at the file on the desk, his face cycling through shades of purple I had never seen before. For a moment, I thought he might actually have a heart attack. But Robert Holt wasn't the type to go out quietly. He was a cornered animal, and cornered animals bite. You think you're so smart, he spat, his voice trembling with a dangerous mix of humiliation and rage. You come back here with your fancy uniform and your high and mighty attitude, checking my books like you're the IRS? I'm checking the books because you stole the house, Dad, I replied, my voice steady, my posture relaxed but ready. I didn't steal anything. I raised you. I put food on your table, he screamed, spit flying from his mouth. And this is how you repay me? By threatening me with jail? He took another step forward. I didn't move. Give me those papers, Maria. No. That one word snapped the last thread of his control. With a roar that sounded more like a growl, he lunged at me. His hand was raised, aiming for my face again, just like at the law office. He wanted to slap the defiance out of me. He wanted to put the little girl back in her place. But the little girl wasn't home. My body moved before my brain even processed the threat. It was muscle memory, drilled into me on the mats at Quantico and the humid gyms of Norfolk. As his arm swung down, I didn't flinch. I stepped inside his guard, intercepting his wrist with my left hand while my right hand clamped down on his elbow. It was a basic joint manipulation technique from the Marine Corps Martial Arts Program, IMCMAPE. Simple, efficient, brutal if necessary. I twisted his wrist outward while driving his elbow upward. The mechanics of the human body are non-negotiable. His center of gravity collapsed. He let out a yelp of pain as I spun him around and slammed him chest first onto the mahogany desk, right on top of the pile of fraudulent loan documents. Ow, my arm, you're breaking my arm, he shrieked, his face pressed against the foreclosure notice. I held him there, applying just enough pressure to keep him immobilized. I leaned down, my mouth inches from his ear. I am not a 16-year-old girl anymore, Robert, I whispered, my voice cold as ice. And I am not a punching bag. If you ever try to touch me again, I won't just hold you down. Do you understand? I released him and shoved him backward. He stumbled, catching himself on the bookshelf, rubbing his wrist, looking at me with wide, terrified eyes. He had never seen me like this. He realized for the first time in his life that he was physically outmatched. You assaulted him, Eric yelled from the corner. He had been cowering by the door, but now that the physical danger was over, he found his courage. I'm calling the cops. You're crazy, Maria. You're a psycho. I turned my gaze to Eric, my brother, the 34-year-old toddler. Go ahead, Eric, I said, pointing to the phone on the desk. Call the police, please. I'm sure they'd love to hear about the BMW you bought with a dead man's money. Eric froze, his mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. I walked over to the desk and grabbed the stack of American Express statements I had separated earlier. You want to talk about rights? You want to talk about what's fair? I threw the stack of papers at him. The sheets fluttered through the air like snow, hitting him in the chest and scattering across the dirty floor. Look at them, Eric, I commanded. Look at your lifestyle. Bottle service at Marquis, dinners at Nobu, weekends in the Hamptons, $12,000 a month. Eric looked down at the papers at his feet, his face flushing red. Dad said he had it covered, Eric stammered, his voice taking on that whining tone I hated. He said it was an investment in my networking. He stole it. I stepped closer to him, backing him against the wall. He stole Grandpa's identity to pay for your delusions of grandeur. You aren't networking, you see, Eric. You're unemployed. You're a parasite. The word hung in the air. Parasite. I'm not. Eric started to protest, tears welling up in his eyes. Yes, you are, I cut him off. You have sucked this family dry. You let Dad commit felonies just so you didn't have to get a job at Starbucks. You watched him drown, and you just asked for more water. I turned back to my father, who was still rubbing his wrist, looking old and defeated. The bluster was gone. The rage was gone. All that was left was a pathetic, scared man who knew the game was over. And you, I said to him, you aren't the landlord. You aren't the patriarch. You're a fraud. You have spent your entire life trying to look rich instead of being a good father. I walked over to the broken door frame and pointed into the hallway. Grandpa Walter used to read the Bible to me on Sundays, I said, my voice softening just a fraction, not out of kindness, but out of solemnity. Do you remember his favorite verse, Dad? Galatians 6:7. My father looked at the floor, refusing to meet my eyes. Do not be deceived. God is not mocked, for whatever one sows, that will he also reap. I let the words sink in. You sowed neglect, Dad. You sowed abuse. You sowed lies and greed. And now? I gestured around the rotting room, at the foreclosure notice, at his terrified son. Now you are reaping the harvest. Maria, please, Dad whispered, his voice cracking. We have nowhere to go. The credit cards are maxed out. They'll take the truck next week. That sounds like a you problem, I said. Not a me problem. I checked my watch. It is 4:30 p.m. I am the trustee of the Walter Morgan estate. I am revoking your permission to occupy this property, effective immediately. You can't do that, Eric squeaked. I can, I said, pulling my phone out of my pocket. I can have the sheriff here in 10 minutes to remove trespassers. And while he's here, I can hand him this file on the bank fraud. I held up the phone. Your choice, leave on your own feet or leave in handcuffs. The silence lasted for 5 seconds, but it felt like an hour. Then, without a word, my father pushed himself off the bookshelf. He didn't look at Eric. He didn't look at me. He just walked out of the room, his shoulders slumped, a broken man. Eric looked at me, then at the scattered papers, then at his father's retreating back. You're a bitch, Maria, he muttered, grabbing his car keys. Maybe, I said, watching him scurry out the door. But I'm a bitch with a house, and you're just a guest who overstayed his welcome. Get out, right now. Silence is heavy. But the silence that followed my threat to call the FBI was crushing. It had physical weight. It pressed down on the shoulders of the two men in front of me, bending them until they snapped. My father, Robert Holt, stood in the center of his ruined study. The red rage that had fueled him moments ago had drained away, leaving behind a complexion the color of old ash. He looked at the phone in my hand as if it were a loaded gun pointed at his chest. He knew I wasn't bluffing. That was the terrifying part for him. He knew that the daughter he had dismissed as soft had been forged in steel by the United States Navy. If I said I would make the call, I would make the call. Maria, he whispered. The word came out like a rasping cough. You wouldn't. Try me, I said, my thumb hovering over the screen. Bank fraud, wire fraud, identity theft. You forged a dead veteran's signature to fund a gambling addiction. Do you know what the sentencing guidelines are for that amount of money? You're looking at 10 years, Dad. Minimum. You won't be going to a nice, club-fed, white-collar resort. You'll be in federal prison. I took a step forward. And the neighbors? Oh, they'll see it all. I won't let you sneak out the back. When the agents come, they'll park right out front. Mrs. Higgins next door will see you in handcuffs. That was the dagger. For a narcissist like my father, prison was scary, but public humiliation was fatal. His knees actually gave out. It wasn't theatrical. It was a total mechanical failure of his body. He stumbled back and collapsed, not into a chair, but onto the dusty hardwood floor. He slumped against the filing cabinet, his legs splayed out in front of him. And then, Robert Holt, the man who terrified me for my entire childhood, began to cry. It wasn't a dignified weep. It was an ugly, heaving sob. Snot ran from his nose. He clutched his chest. I can't go to jail, he blubbered, wiping his face with his sleeve. I'm 62 years old. I have high blood pressure. They'll kill me in there. Maria, please. I'm your father. I looked down at him. I waited for an apology. I waited for him to say, I'm sorry I stole from you. I'm sorry I hit you. But it never came. He was crying for himself. He was mourning his reputation, his comfort, his freedom. He wasn't sorry he did it. He was sorry he got caught. You should have thought about your blood pressure before you drove to Mohegan Sun with Grandpa's equity, I said coldly. But the real horror show was just beginning. Eric, who had been frozen by the door clutching his car keys, suddenly seemed to process what this meant for him. The fear in his eyes shifted into a frantic, desperate anger. He realized the ATM was broken. The free ride was over. He didn't rush to comfort his sobbing father. He didn't offer to help. Instead, he turned on him. You said you had it handled, Eric screamed, his voice cracking. He threw his keys onto the floor. You told me the trust was just a rumor. You told me the money was ours. Dad looked up at his golden child, blinking through his tears. Eric, I tried. I did everything for you. You did nothing. Eric kicked the leg of the desk violently. You're a liar. You let me buy that car. You let me rack up the Amex. And now what? Now I'm supposed to go to jail too, because of you? I paid your debts, Dad yelled back, finding a shred of defensive energy. I risked everything to keep you happy. You risked it because you're a loser who couldn't earn his own money. Eric spat the words out like poison. God, you're pathetic. Look at you, crying on the floor like a baby. No wonder Mom was always miserable. I stood there, motionless, witnessing a scene that felt almost Shakespearean in its tragedy. The two villains of my life were tearing each other apart. The golden child was devouring the king. It was the ultimate betrayal, yet it was completely predictable. My father had raised Eric to be selfish, entitled, and lacking in empathy. He had created a monster who believed the world owed him everything. And now, that monster was feeding on its creator. Eric, Dad whimpered, reaching a hand out toward his son. Don't say that. We're a team. We aren't a team, Eric sneered, stepping back from his father's outstretched hand as if it were contagious. I have to look out for myself now. I'm not going down for your fraud. Eric turned to me, his eyes wild. Maria, listen. I didn't sign anything. I didn't know about the forgery. It was all him. You can't report me. I was a victim too. I looked at my brother, a 34-year-old man willing to send his father to prison to save his own skin. You spent the money, Eric, I said quietly. Ignorance isn't a defense when you're driving a stolen BMW. It was a gift, Eric yelled, then looked back at Dad with pure hatred. You ruined my life. You promised me this house. You promised me everything. Get out, I said again. This time my voice wasn't angry. It was exhausted. Both of you, before I change my mind about that phone call. Eric didn't hesitate. He snatched his keys off the floor and stormed out of the house without looking back at his father. We heard the front door slam, followed by the screech of tires as he peeled out of the driveway. He was running away, just like he always did, leaving me alone with Dad. Robert Holt sat amidst the wreckage of his lies. The silence returned, but now it was filled with the soft, wet sounds of his weeping. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him. The blazer was wrinkled. The comb-over in his hair had fallen apart, revealing his bald scalp. He wasn't a monster anymore. He wasn't a patriarch. He was just a sad, broken old man sitting on a dirty floor in a house he didn't own, abandoned by the son he worshipped. I looked at him, and I expected to feel triumph. I expected to feel the rush of victory. But I didn't. As I watched him sob into his hands, terrified and alone, I felt something far worse than hate. I felt pity. Not the warm pity of compassion, but the cold, distant pity you feel when you see a rabid animal that has finally been put down. He was pathetic, and realizing he was pathetic stripped him of his power over me forever. I lowered the phone. I didn't dial the FBI. Not yet. Get up, I said to him. He looked up confused, his eyes red and swollen. Get up, Robert, I said, using his first name. We're going to the kitchen. We need to talk about your surrender. The late afternoon sun cast long, melancholic shadows across the perfectly manicured grass of Willowbrook Veterans Cemetery. It was quiet here, the kind of quiet you can't find anywhere else, heavy with history and peace. I stood in front of a simple white marble headstone. Walter J. Morgan, U.S. Navy, WQTC. I reached into the pocket of my dress whites and pulled out a quarter. It's a military tradition. A penny means you visited. A nickel means you trained together. A dime means you served together, and a quarter means you were with them when they passed away. I wasn't there when Grandpa died. I was deployed in the Mediterranean. But in spirit, I had never left his side. I placed the coin on the cold stone. It made a sharp clink. I got him, Grandpa, I whispered to the wind. I have him right where you knew he would end up. For the last hour, I had been standing there, wrestling with a decision that felt heavier than the foreclosure notice. I had the power to destroy my father. One phone call to the FBI, and Robert Holt would spend his golden years in a federal cell. It would be justice. It would be vengeance. It would be exactly what the old Maria, the angry teenage girl, wanted. But as I looked at Grandpa's name, I remembered something he told me once when I was furious about Dad missing my swim meet. Maria, he had said, puffing on his pipe, strength isn't about how hard you can hit. It's about how much you can lift. Sometimes the heaviest thing you have to lift is someone who has fallen. I thought about the Bible verse that had been echoing in my head. Psalm 27:10. When my father and my mother forsake me, then the Lord will take me up. I had been forsaken, I had been abandoned, but I had also been lifted up by the Navy, by Grandpa, by my own resilience. I didn't need to destroy my father to prove I was strong. I was already strong. Destroying him wouldn't fix the house. It wouldn't heal the past. It would just leave me with a ghost in a cage. I took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of damp earth and pine. I knew what I had to do. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. It was something harder. It was discipline. I drove back to 42 Oakwood Lane. The sun was setting, painting the rotting house in a deceptively warm orange glow. I walked into the kitchen. My father was sitting at the scratched wooden table. He hadn't moved. He wasn't drinking. He looked small, deflated, like a balloon that had lost its helium. He looked up when I entered, terror flashing in his eyes. He was waiting for the sirens. I sat down opposite him. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten. I placed a single sheet of paper on the table. It wasn't a police report. It was a handwritten contract I had drafted in the car. I'm not calling the FBI, Dad, I said quietly. His shoulders slumped and a sob escaped his throat. Oh, thank God. Maria, thank you. I promise. I'll... Stop. I cut him off, raising a hand. I'm not calling them yet. This isn't a pardon, Robert. It's a parole agreement. He wiped his eyes, looking confused. What? What does that mean? It means you aren't going to prison, but you are effectively under house arrest. My house, my rules. I tapped the paper. Item 1, I began, my voice carrying the authority of an officer briefing a subordinate. You are selling the Ford F-150, tomorrow. You can't afford the lease, and you don't need a truck to drive to the liquor store. You will use the proceeds to pay off the immediate interest on the HELOC, so the bank doesn't take the house next week. Dad nodded frantically. Okay, yes, I can do that. Item 2, I continued. The master bedroom is no longer yours. That is the owner's suite. Since I am the owner, I will decide what to do with it. You are moving your things into the downstairs guest room. It's smaller, but it's warm. It's more than you deserve. He flinched, his pride taking a hit, but he didn't argue. Item 3, I said, leaning in. You need a job. A job? He blinked. Maria, I'm 62. I haven't worked in. I don't care, I said. You have hands, you have feet. Walmart is hiring greeters. Home Depot needs stalkers. You are going to get a minimum wage job, and every single paycheck will be garnished by me to pay back the equity you stole from this estate. But what will people say? He whispered, the old vanity creeping back in. They'll say you're an honest man trying to fix his mistakes, I countered. Or they can say you're a felon in federal prison. Pick one. He lowered his head. I'll get a job. Good, I sat back. And finally, Eric, Dad looked up, hope flickering in his eyes. Can he come back? He has nowhere to go, Maria. He's sleeping in his car. No, I said. The word was absolute. But he's your brother. He can't survive out there. He can't survive because you never let him, I said, my voice softening with sad realization. You crippled him, Dad. You gave him everything he wanted and nothing he needed. If I let him back in this house, he will never grow up. He will just eat us alive until there is nothing left. He'll hate us, Dad said, tears streaming down his face again. He already hates us, I replied. Let him hate us. Maybe that hate will fuel him to finally get a job. Eric is banned from this property. If he shows up, I call the police for trespassing. Do we have an agreement? I slid a pen across the table. My father looked at the pen. He looked at the contract that stripped him of his luxury truck, his bedroom, his pride, and his favorite son. He looked at the daughter he had slapped just hours ago, the daughter who was now the only thing standing between him and a cage. He picked up the pen. His hand shook, his knuckles white. He signed his name. Robert Holt. It wasn't a signature of power. It was a signature of surrender. Thank you, he whispered, not looking at me. Don't thank me, I said, standing up and taking the paper. Make your bed tomorrow morning. That's how you thank me. I walked out of the kitchen, leaving him alone with the hum of the refrigerator. Outside, the first dry leaf of autumn drifted down from the oak tree, scratching against the window. Summer was ending. The heat was breaking. I looked at the calendar on the wall. November was coming. Thanksgiving was coming. And for the first time in 30 years, I wasn't dreading it. I had torn the house down to its foundation, and now, brick by brick, I was going to rebuild it. If you live in New England, you know that the air changes in late November. The humidity of summer vanishes, replaced by a crisp, biting chill that smells of wood smoke and dried leaves. It's a season that forces you to seek warmth, not just from a furnace, but from the people around you. 3 months had passed since the showdown in the study. 3 months since the treaty of the kitchen table. I stood on the front porch of 42 Oakwood Lane, holding a mug of hot apple cider. The house didn't look like a foreclosure waiting to happen anymore. The peeling paint had been scraped and primed. The knee-high jungle of crabgrass was gone, replaced by a lawn that had been raked clean of autumn leaves. It wasn't perfect. The shutters still needed a fresh coat of black paint. But it looked cared for. It looked respected. Inside, the house smelled the way a home is supposed to smell on the fourth Thursday of November. It was a rich, savory symphony of roasting turkey, sage stuffing, caramelized onions, and the sweet, spicy scent of pumpkin pie. I walked back inside, wiping my boots on the mat. The TV in the living room was on low volume, broadcasting the Lions game, a Thanksgiving tradition that was as reliable as the sunrise. But the room itself was different. The mountains of pizza boxes were gone. The blackout curtains were open, letting in the pale afternoon light. And in the kitchen, standing over the oven with a pair of oven mitts, was my father. Robert Holt looked different. The navy blue blazer with the gold buttons was gone, likely sold at a consignment shop in Fairfield. He was wearing a simple flannel shirt tucked into a pair of Levi's that were a little loose around the waist. He had lost weight. He looked tired, yes. There were dark circles under his eyes, but he also looked solid. Hey, he said, pulling the 20-pound bird out of the oven. Steam billowed up, fogging his glasses. Check the temperature on this for me, will you? My eyes aren't what they used to be. Sure, Dad, I said, grabbing the meat thermometer. My back is killing me, he groaned. But there was a strange note of pride in his voice. We had a double truck shipment at the store yesterday, Black Friday prep. I hauled 50 cases of flat-screen TVs before lunch. Walmart keeps you busy, I said, checking the turkey. It's perfectly cooked, 165 degrees. Yeah, well, he wiped his hands on a dish towel. The manager, distinct kid named Jason, said I'm the only one who actually greets customers like they're human beings. Might make me a shift lead next month. It's an extra $1.50 an hour. I looked at him. 3 months ago, this man thought manual labor was beneath him. He thought an hourly wage was an insult. Now, he was bragging about a potential promotion at Walmart. He was working 40 hours a week, standing on concrete floors, earning his keep. He paid me rent every Friday, cash, to cover his share of the utilities and the debt he owed the estate. It wasn't a lot of money, but it was honest money. "Let's eat," I said. We sat at the dining room table. It wasn't set with the fancy china. We didn't need to impress anyone today. Just simple plates, the turkey, a bowl of mashed potatoes, and a can of jellied cranberry sauce because that was the only kind Dad liked. Dad picked up the carving knife. His hands, once soft and manicured, were rough now. He sliced the meat with a focus I hadn't seen in years. He poured us both a glass of iced tea. He had been sober for 88 days. "Maria," he said, putting the knife down. He didn't look at his food. He looked at me. His eyes were clear, free of the glassy haze of bourbon. "Yeah, Dad." "I want to say grace," he said. We bowed our heads. "Lord," he began, his voice raspy. "Thank you for this food. Thank you for this roof." He paused, swallowing hard. "And thank you for my daughter. Thank you for giving her the strength to stop me when I couldn't stop myself. I'm sorry, Maria, for everything. For the lost years. For the fraud. For not being the father you deserved." The silence that followed wasn't heavy like it used to be. It was peaceful. "Thank you, Dad," I whispered. "I forgive you." And I meant it. I didn't forget, but I forgave. Because looking at him now, I realized that my grandfather was right. People can change, but sometimes they need to hit the ground hard enough to break the shell they've built around themselves. Just then, headlights swept across the dining room window. I stood up and walked to the window. A battered, 10-year-old Toyota Corolla was pulling into the driveway. It had a dent in the rear bumper, and the muffler was hanging a little low. It was an ugly car. But the man stepping out of it wasn't the golden child in a Ralph Lauren polo. Eric was wearing a gray mechanic's jumpsuit with a patch that said Mike's Auto Body on the chest. His hands were stained with grease that no amount of scrubbing could fully remove, the mark of a working man. He looked thinner, too. The softness in his face was gone, replaced by a leaner, hungrier look. He reached into the back seat and pulled out a white bakery box. "He came," Dad said, standing behind me, his voice trembling slightly. "I told him he could come for dinner," I said, watching my brother walk up the path. "On one condition. He had to drive a car he paid for, wearing clothes he bought, bringing food he purchased with his own money." Eric stopped at the front door. He looked nervous. He adjusted his collar, took a deep breath, and knocked. I opened the door. My brother looked at me. There was no arrogance left in his eyes, just a quiet, tentative hope. "Hey, Maria," he said, holding up the box. "I brought an apple pie. It's not homemade, but I bought it, with my paycheck." "Apple pie is perfect," I said, stepping aside. "Come in, Eric. Dinner is ready." He walked in, the smell of grease and hard work following him, mixing with the smell of the turkey. He saw Dad standing in the hallway. They looked at each other, two men who had lost their fake kingdom but found their real footing. "Hey, Dad," Eric said softly. "I like the flannel." "Hey, son," Dad smiled, a genuine, crinkly-eyed smile. "I like the jumpsuit. Suits you." As I watched them walk into the dining room together, talking about Eric's new job fixing transmissions, I felt a warmth spread through my chest that had nothing to do with the heating system. I walked over to the mantel above the fireplace. There, in the center, was the framed photo of Grandpa Walter standing next to his Mustang. I touched the frame one last time. For years, I thought the inheritance was the house. I thought the legacy was the $14 million in assets the lawyer had mentioned. But I was wrong. The money was just paper. The house was just wood and stone. The real inheritance was this moment. It was the ability to take a broken, toxic mess and forge it into something real. It was the lesson that love isn't about enabling people to be weak. It's about challenging them to be strong. "We made it, Grandpa," I whispered. "We finally cleaned the house." I turned around and walked into the dining room to join my family. Not the family I was born into, but the family I had built. Looking back, I realized that the hardest battles aren't fought on the ocean, but at our own kitchen tables. We are often taught that loving our family means saying yes to every request. But I learned that true love is brave enough to say no. By cutting off the financial lifeline, I didn't hurt my father and brother. I gave them back their dignity. If you are enabling a loved one's bad behavior out of guilt, remember this. You aren't helping them swim, you are just prolonging the drowning. The greatest inheritance isn't the check you leave behind, it is the character you build in the people you love. I know my story had a redemption arc, but I also know many of you are still in the trenches, fighting to set boundaries with toxic family members. I want to hear your voice. Do you think I did the right thing by forcing my elderly father to work at Walmart, or was I too harsh? Let me know your honest thoughts in the comments below. And if this story gave you the courage to finally stand up for yourself, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Let's build a community where justice and self-respect always win. Until next time, stay strong.